Good. And I got the timing wrong. We have more time before. I'm not going to let you take a break as quickly
That's
as I
great,
said I
Alan,
would.
because I want to interrupt.
Wait, who's in charge here?
We are.
He's always in charge.
The News 21 project at Arizona State has all these content partners like what you're talking about. They trade the stories for business intelligence of who's reading them. And so they know what their overall aggregate audience is. So the news organizations in that instance are not getting charged any money, but they have to come up with something in return for the content.
Kevin.
So, one of the other wrinkles here, of course, is investigative journalism and also journalism that serves underserved communities and communities that, frankly, are not monetizable directly, right? So one of the things that we talk about a lot is, if you're in a market, if you look at even at INN's distribution, we tend to be not where the news deserts are, although we're getting increasingly there, but we tend to be in markets that can support this journalism. So, one of the things I've said, and this is with the greatest respect to the larger organizations in the room, if only CPI, CAR, ProPublica, and Texas Tribune survived, we will have failed, right? That really and truthfully, I think the need is to make sure that communities throughout the United States, often in underserved and very poor communities, also have viable models.
Which happens to be what you're doing.
We're trying, but so when we look at this and you say which business models fit, it really does depend on the market. I mean, we've said this many different ways. It does depend on the market, and frankly, some kinds of journalism. An example would be Southern Investigative Reporting Foundation does 6 reports a year. And when they do their reports, their traffic spikes for about a week, and it's great stuff, in-depth stuff, business stuff. But they're not equipped to have ongoing conversations with their communities. So they have to, by necessity, distribute that content out, and their value proposition for what they produce is very, very different when you're producing content on an ongoing basis. Yeah. So it's very important, I think, that we don't lose sight that not every type of nonprofit has the same market opportunity or the same commercial opportunity or the same revenue opportunity.
And the result of that, I mean, how do you address that?
We have to convince more people that, frankly, I still think that philanthropy needs to be in the mix, and we need to understand that this, to Jeff's point, there is an ecosystem here, and that certain content will need to be subsidized if we believe it's important. And it is unrealistic and, frankly, not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's disingenuous, but not every nonprofit is going to be self-sustainable.
How many of the organizations, and I'll come back to you, Rose, but how many of the organizations represented here in the room, just a quick show of hands, believe that the majority of the journalism you do is investigative journalism? Raise your hand. So it's close to half, maybe a little over half. I think our survey showed of the 93, it was 20-something%.
A little less than half.
Yeah.
I actually had very similar thoughts to Kevin. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating about the Knight report is that it begins to actually set up visual patterns of revenue, of revenue models for particular kinds of journalism groups. I think that it gets to Kevin's point that we're not all going to look the same. Some of us are going to be very attractive to advertisers, and some of us will not be at all attractive to advertisers. Some of us are going to be great at attracting corporate sponsors, and others of us won't. And so the question is, what types of organizations can attract what kind of revenue and with what kind of effort and tools? And I actually, one of the things that excited me about coming to this meeting today was, looking at these 2 reports and beginning to see these patterns of business models. That's, in fact, what we need as nonprofits, as nonprofit news sites to be able to move forward. I do think that we have some extra tools to work with, which is what I was trying to say before. We have some extra tools because we are nonprofits. We should particularly we have the ability to ask for and receive tax deductible donations, and to say to people, we're dependent on you because we are a nonprofit. We're not enriching ourselves through that. That's a very powerful tool. And secondly, we're attractive to volunteers because we're not enriching ourselves through volunteer activity either. So it looks like a common project for a volunteer. These two things also are somewhat connected because they are civic. There's civic benefits that we get from being nonprofits, and in fact, Wikipedia found recently they did a very, very big fundraising project, and they found that the rates of giving amongst the people who actually put their hands to the editing was much higher than the rates of giving among people who just consumed the product. That says something about engagement that I think we really need to listen to. So for us smaller people who are likely to use volunteers and maybe are not going to get as much big donor money, this is in fact an incredibly important piece of information and a realm that we need to work.
Donors become consumers.
Donors.
Committed consumers.
Well, active volunteers can become donors, and they also will attract a bunch of consumers because they themselves are networked. So it's a business model of a type that I think we need to explore. But I think there are a number of these kinds of business models around the work that we're doing that we haven't quite surfaced so we can see them yet.
So we're going to do John, then Vincent, then Rose. But before we do, we haven't really talked about events at all. Is anybody around the table making significant revenue from events? Emily.
I mean, I think that from the very beginning, the Tribune, this was, I think, the biggest eye-opener to me is that this many people actually want to be in a room together at 7:30 in the morning for a breakfast, policy hearing on water, for example. You can have a sellout crowd, but I think, and I was going to talk about this a little bit in the community engagement side, but what's been fascinating, and I think I saw in the night report that a ton of you are starting to do this, is just how much money can be made around sponsorships and attendance of these events.
My background, I'm at Columbia now, but I was at The Guardian for a long time, where actually that sense of community is much more easily fostered when you can offer something which is, and this is a statement of the obvious, which is bandwidth restricted, and that's not putting paywall up, it's rather offering people, live experience. And if you look at just pans of attendance across everything, the more you have digital ubiquity of information, the more people want to actually kind of have excuses to meet each other. And it's such an obvious observation, it still feels like it's hardly worth saying, but at the same time, I think it's just one of those societal trends which news, because it convenes so well, has always seen, the kind of conference business, as to use Professor Jarvis's phrase, has had cooties for quite a long time. It's been sort of something that people wanted to keep away from because it felt like a different type of business model. But it seems to me that it's a very obvious, concrete way of taking your reach and impact and turning it into money.
So you think there's an opportunity that has not been fully tapped by the folks in this room?
I actually really do. I really do. I think that as I say, it's kind of, if you're in the middle of New York City, it's always hard to get people to kind of events, but actually everywhere else, that idea that you can convene and meet as you do more shopping online, as everything else becomes a frictionless experience.
I think Tina Brown just coined a new phrase for this sort of activity as she got booted out the door at the Daily Beast. She said she was going off to do theatrical journalism.
Right. I would say
so
just
maybe,
quickly, yeah. I mean, yeah.
So maybe more theatrical journalism is what we need.
Right.
John.
I was just going to say quickly, there's a cost associated with this, obviously. I mean, I think John probably knows better than I do, but I think last year we spent almost $200,000 putting on these events. It ended up bringing in almost $1 million. But we had to go, not everybody's in Austin, so we were spending money going all over the state to try to sort of engage folks and bring them in. So it's not a cost neutral. There's definitely, and there are a lot of bodies involved in putting on productions of this nature to make a sizable revenue dent.
Hard for the small guys, you think? No, Rose, you disagree?
Possible.
Oh,
I
not
mean,
hard, impossible.
I mean, I don't have the capacity. I just don't have the capacity. I mean, unless I can find someone who's a volunteer coordinator, to do the whole event. I'm a one-person shop with a bunch of freelancers like Dylan.
Not true.
Jeff disagrees. He thinks it's a cootie reaction.
No, not at all. I spare my cooties for the most important moments. No, I think that we found, when we did research on business models, we found that there are a lot of sites that are doing it well. Brownstoner in Brooklyn is a key example, Brooklyn-based. There are a lot of local blogs that are doing this well and find value in not only using it as a way to get content, but bring people together, sponsors, vendors, all kinds of things.
Susan, you have something to say on that.
I didn't raise my hand originally because the part about making significant money, I couldn't say yes. I think part of it is about knowing your market and your audience. We're in Oakland, which is a poor community. I look at Berkeley with envy, and we've had over 2,500 people come to our events in the past year. We convene events all the time, and we sell out every time. We're great at it.
But no revenue?
Well, revenue, yes, but we're in a
no-
community where we have to charge, on an average, $15 or less for an event, have a sliding scale for people who truly cannot afford to pay, which people do not use heavily. Most people who can pay. And, if we clear $300 on a $1,000 event, we've done really well. So we really use it as a marketing, outreach, and community engagement tool. From a profit perspective, it's not cost effective. But we love events, and we're super committed to them as engagement. But the $150 conference, for our particular market, we would have to change our market to make that really work.
Okay. John, then Vincent, then Tom, then Rose. I guess that wasn't your comment. Was a non-event conference, so you still want in here.
Well, I just, I'm trying to do a statewide media organization, so I'm trying to build, readership all over the state. So where do I do it? My state's 450 miles in one direction, so no one place to do it. I mean, I have big readerships in 2 of the major markets, but
I picked the mountains or the beach.
Right, correct. Yeah, right, exactly.
John.
I think one of the things that knits a bunch of the really smart things that have been said here together is this coming back to the notion of equity investors versus revenue, coming back to the notion that Dick was talking about in terms of the difference between building a for-profit and a nonprofit enterprise, and the willingness and forethought required on behalf of, and I'm going to call them investors, not donors, just with my sales shoes on, to fund forward losses and that to me is the difference between equity and revenue, right? And so all of these things are incredibly important at a tactical level, some of them at a strategic level. In my mind, the most important thing that needs to be done is the consciousness raising of a new generation of equity investors in these things, because without the reason you can't go glom events onto your business is because you didn't raise the equity up front. I'm not saying that in any imaginable scenario you would have, but it requires that level of forward investment to go get the events person.
But so how do we do that? I mean, how
I
do
don't
we
know.
raise the consciousness of...
I don't know, but it's to me it's really on my mind because in 08, 09 there was this sort of blip of conversation about informing communities or nonprofit journalism or whatever you want to call it as a category of philanthropy. That sort of fizzled when people realized that newspapers weren't just going to go away entirely. And so I don't know the answer, but it's damned important, and I just want to make sure everybody understands. I think bringing donors into this ecosystem is more important today, not less important, even though we're pedaling like hell, trying not to be dependent upon them.
I'm going to come back to you, Joe, but I want to focus on the people we haven't heard from yet, which is Vincent, Tom, Steve.
To look in on the foundation piece of this with a little bit more nuance. I think there was some sweeping statements about what foundations are like, and what good is a generalization if it doesn't sweep? But certainly, there are foundations on one end who are the large, very heavily staffed types of organizations, and the others that are vest pocket financial instruments on the behalf of a particular donor that's very personal. And then there's a lot of in-between, thousands of in-between, where particularly it might be lightly staffed, but a strategic group of trustees that are doing this. And so I think, many of us were, a few of us were lucky enough to be with the Tao family last night at the Tao Foundation event celebrating 25 years of grant making. They're well known in this room because of the Tao Centers at CUNY and Columbia, but they're like a lot of other funders that mainly do other things, and they do a little bit of media, which is important. You might not know of the Peary Foundation in Silicon Valley, which does mostly social innovation work, social entrepreneurs, but they also do some important work supporting David Bornstein's work at the Solutions Journalism Network. And then, according to the upcoming data from the Foundation Center, 3,698 other foundations that are supporting some aspect of media. So, it's not just a handful of usual suspects who are staffed, and then all of the rest of these are individuals who are, just individual donors. There's a lot of nuance in between, and I think that's evident from your own data, which says that 26 of the respondents had 75 to 100% of their income from foundation grants. 25 had between 25 and 75, and 35 didn't give you an answer. So, only 14 had less than 25% in foundation funding. So, I think there's a lot of work here that could be done to really develop that set of relationships and understand that better.
Yeah. Tom.
I'm going to go back a little bit to the question of theatrical journalism or event-based stuff. For me, there's sort of, if we abstract it back, journalism used to be adhered to the page, the printed page. Now, can we make it adhere to something else, to events, or which clearly the Texas Tribune has had some great success at, and seems quite visibly to be a struggle for a one-person organization across our whole state. And that sort of brings me to the critical importance of understanding where the journalistic institution sits within its greater ecosystem and what it is capable of doing. And just one example, the Zocalo Public Square folks who sort of lead with the event-based journalism. The site is somewhat of a secondary thing to that, and we've just got used to the printed page is the starting point. And I just wonder if we can't just think a lot more broadly about where it goes to maximize how we present the value proposition of the hard work that goes into creating this public interest good. So.
Steve?
One quick point on the business. We've talked about the business side, and most people are treating that as synonymous with revenue. But there's also the marketing side, and when we talk about business or even non-editorial, it's revenue marketing, and also we haven't talked about technology. And I'm mentioning that because one of the things that might be interesting to tease out at some point is there's a certain amount of work that is done by a local that is inherently local. There's just no way around. There's no way of sharing services. It just has to be done by a local group. But then there's other functions that could be shared, either among other groups in a network way. It could be shared if there were a shared services organization of some sort that were providing services. INN does some of this. But in the for-profit world, the way if a mogul was looking at a whole set of fragmented businesses, one of the things they would look at is whether or not there are certain economies of scale that could be achieved, in that case, by buying them all up. But that's not the only way of achieving economies of scale.
So can you put a little meat on those bones? I mean, what are some of the, because I think it'd be useful, particularly for the foundations here, what are some of the kind of shared services that you think could be outsourced to a larger
Well, I bet
organization?
others will have more specifics, but for instance, everyone's talked about development capacity and the ability to develop membership models. That's an actual expertise. It's not just a matter of labor. There's some knowledge to that. If there were people that small groups could tap into, there may be software that they could tap into. There may be technology aspects to that. Others will probably have specific ideas. But
Joel and then Amy.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, but first I want to say, I think the insight that there are many different kinds of organizations in this ecosystem with many inherently different business models because they have different missions, like the difference between an investigative site that, writes maybe 8 stories a year and relies on other media to distribute it versus sites like MinPost that are trying to build their own audience through volume and then sell that audience through, sponsorship and advertising. They're radically different. And one of the challenges is you bring together groups of people like this. And I know Kevin has this challenge in the variety he has in INN, and I think you got this problem in this room. you bring all these people together, and they are not in the same business, and they don't have the same models, and they don't have the same needs. And then if you do have advice for certain subsets, they don't have the resources to carry them out. So the suggestion that I would make, we haven't really.
It sounds like the suggestion is go home.
No, that's not it.
Okay.
You haven't asked for solutions, but one thing that could be done, I believe, is to divide this ecosystem into subgroups that actually have a common pattern and interest, and treat them as separate groups, and then have whether it's the foundation world or the wealthy donors or whoever, I think the foundations that care about journalism could be the leaders in doing this, invest in two things. One is the centralized services that Steve is talking about, but then secondly, invest enough in the organizations that they will have the capacity on their end to make use of the services that are provided to them.
So let's. I'm going to go to Amy first, but let's use Joel, your comments and Steve comments as a kind of a pivot to use the 15 minutes or so we have before the break to talk about, okay, what are the solutions that can come out of this conversation we're having here today? Amy.
Yeah, and I think what I was going to add will actually lead into that conversation too, which is spinning off what Steve said, but going back to what we heard very early on in this conversation, which was at least a number of the funders in the room saying they might be in it for 20 years or more. And then Eric saying, you got to show us that you've got some reach and that you've got some impact. But we also know from our research that the majority of these nonprofits, even if they're all very different, have a staff of less than 5. So how do you show that you're reaching audience, and how do you be able to think about actually where you could go for revenue and in your community versus somebody else's community? Which then leads to the question of whether there are some non-monetary ways that these foundations can really offer support in a long term that would have even more lasting impact or help for your organization, whether it's consulting on business strategy or developing technology platforms or whatever the case may be, that could really be something that would bring help beyond just some dollars in the bank.
Okay, solutions. Andy, we haven't heard from you. I'm sure that's because you've been sitting there formulating the answer to this question, right? Do you have anything what would help you?
Well, absolutely. The idea of consulting and offering access to expertise is very valuable, and we are in fact doing a lot of that through INN. The upcoming CJET training will be breaking into groups under a coach, and we'll be working with some similarly situated centers, let's say. So I think there is some recognition of that, and Joel and I, our organizations are collaborating on some work, and we have a keen understanding of how different the goals of our organizations are. I think one thing we haven't talked about regarding what could be shared is data, obviously, and the collaborations that we've done through INN and through other networks have been very successful. If the data has been made available journalistically, and I'm sure there would be business side applications for the sharing of data, donor development strategies, and even potential sharing of those donors, potential donors, and the development of strategies to work on the revenue.
Molly?
Well, I can speak to what we're doing in New Jersey because we're a New Jersey-focused foundation, and we don't attempt to try to treat all of the news and information entities in New Jersey, the ecosystem, as the same. So what we do instead is we fund an initiative at Montclair State University called the Center for Cooperative Media, and their job is to listen to the ecosystem and understand what the needs are, and then provide those services, whether it's data training, business training. We did CJET recently, data journalism training, pooled insurance, pooled liability.
The content sharing network.
Right, so they also set up with Repost.us a content sharing network. So there are probably 20 different news organizations in New Jersey that are all sharing content freely with one another.
Is this happening other places, any of you? Yes, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I think that New Jersey actually is really, in many respects, in the lead now. I mean, as far as how a statewide thing can work, and great work there. Yeah, it's happening all over the place. I mean, you know, you got Lion in the room, you got INN in the room. There's a number of these networks that are really sort of like these hubs that can then bring out, the idea being, of course, that investment through, this is not a pitch, investment through us can have your dollar investment can have a multiplication effect. Just for example, get to another point. On the technology front, INN did a survey about a year and a half ago, and we looked at internally at the INN members, and we found that less than 6% of their budgets were being spent on technology. Could you imagine if you were in a newspaper or a TV, if you only spent 6% on getting the signal out? So we invested in a very simple WordPress stack that we now have over 45 organizations worldwide on, 22 member organizations, and the next step is to integrate CRM into the WordPress stack. So like Voice of San Diego, we can actually identify people who are coming and actually move them along the conversion funnel. Here's a shared resource, it's open source, it's on GitHub, anybody can use it, you don't have to be an INN member. So those investments are happening on back office stuff, and it's just a question of propagating them.
Technology is a big issue that we haven't talked about much. I know we'll probably talk about it some when we get to the engagement point. I mean, our research shows one of the most fascinating things going on in the news space these days is the fact that people are actually reading more than they used to because they have these smartphones in their pocket when they walk around and, you know, can dip in on a regular basis. And yet I think the Knight study showed there were only 3 of the 18 that had actually developed mobile apps. And it's a huge expense. I mean, I spent the last 5-6 years of my life running digital operations for the Wall Street Journal. The amount of money we were spending on technology was frightening because you're developing for the iPhone, you're developing for the Android, you're developing for the tablets. And that's for the external facing technology. There's also the internal technology. Brian, what can we do to help you?
Give me some programmers. I mean, that's on the technology front. I mean, on my wish list is mobile applications. You know, we've started building our database and geotagging all our content, but you know, the dream of developing a mobile app that will present that attractively is a reach for us. And with 4 staff focused on getting the product out, we can't do that kind of development on our own, or even manage a team or pay for a team that could do it. Now, we jumped on the Armstrong CMS platform, and we're probably one of the smaller shops that's using Armstrong. But you know, this idea of having a toolkit and blending in CRM so that we can keep track of subscribers, donors in a sophisticated system. You know, we're thrilled with Armstrong, but I want to be able to take it to the next level, follow what the Texas Tribune is doing. But I need somebody that can come into our shop or be available to us and make that happen. I've got a local technology team working with the Armstrong platform, but we don't have time to go back and sort of figure out, you know, are we branching too far away in our customizations? What has Texas Tribune done that we could just grab and implement? That takes a warm body with a lot of smarts figuring out those platforms.
Did you want to add to that, Susan?
Yeah, I want to say, though, that I think it's really important that people use technology smartly and use open source. So we moved from Drupal to WordPress, one of the most supported platforms. We didn't choose a smaller platform for fewer developers. When we migrated to WordPress, our mobile traffic went up from 2% to 12% because we are now an attractive reading experience on a smartphone, even without a mobile app. We saw this incredible surge. So I think it's really a mistake to think that you have to go from a bad interface that's not mobile friendly to an app. We would love to have an app. I would love to have an iPad tablet. But I also think what's lacking is education, because we found a great solution at very low cost.
Elspeth, then Elizabeth, then Steve.
Yeah, the comment about needing programmers really resonated with me because I'm hearing it from everybody in every field that I work in. And the nonprofit sector just is not competitive for programmers. That said, I think what you just said about using technology smartly is important, and I would hope that not every group would need their own programmer. But So that's really kind of a challenge, I think, for my colleagues and me in the foundation world to figure out how we can get some of these needs met, because I do hear it everywhere I go.
Yeah, Chris, did you want to?
We're in New Jersey. One of the other things we're doing right now is many of you have probably heard of a tiny little radio station called WFMU. It is a hole-in-the-wall station with a worldwide following. It's pretty amazing, the work that they've done. But we've just funded them to build something called, for lack of a better name right now, called the Audience Engine, which we anticipate they'll be able to complete in a relatively short period of time, as in 12 months or so. And it's going to be write once, publish everywhere. We have a lot of high hopes that we can help you out enormously in that. Open source, we're going to make it available everywhere, and then they will probably develop a for-profit side, which is a training side where they can come and actually help you put that in place. But it's been tried for many years, apparently.
Are you going to go to? You're pointing to Charlottesville. You're going to go out in New Jersey?
Absolutely,
Okay.
we would take it anywhere, I think, in the end, because the whole idea here is to enable the entire ecosystem, not just in New Jersey but elsewhere.
Okay, Elizabeth.
So I believe in collaboration. That's why we are a merger, and we're starting 2 new bureaus in the next 3 months. But it's challenging. So I think it has to be, I agree with what people have said, it has to be sort of domain specific. So we all cover education. We're all local. We're doing certain similar things. But there are challenges in doing it that we have to attend to. Like if we're going to have a distribution manager and engagement manager working in 4 different communities all across the country, what does that look like? And what services can be offered and what can't? So I think we're going to learn a lot from that. My second point is that I also believe in collaboration. Looking outside, like, so what can we do solutions? I think we can look outside of our sector. That's where I've found a lot of good ideas in, but also out. So in my case, just being an education reporter and studying, how did charter schools go from tiny little mom and pops to, we need to create charter management organizations, networked or back-end support. So I look a lot at them for guidance for our industry, and I think there's ways to coordinate that knowledge sharing. And then 2, I also look to the technology companies. Like in New York City, our new distribution and engagement person and I went to a tech startup, Birchbox, which you wouldn't think has anything to do with journalism. They sell beauty products, but we met for an hour with their social media team and learned more than we could have learned, I think, in a year talking to each other about social media here in this room. So they have to invest in that. They're way ahead of us. And it just occurred to me while I was sitting in that conference room, if I could bring 5 of my colleagues into this meeting, doesn't Birchbox get a corporate responsibility pat on the back? Don't we all learn a ton? And so unfortunately I pitched it to Birchbox. My friend is an early co-founder, and they said no. But I think if foundations were in the mix,
we'll find them.
We could do it.
Steve.
Yeah, following up on what Joel and Andy were talking about we all have very different missions, and it's best that we find like-minded people to carry these out. I agree with that, but I also think there's an incredible benefit to being in rooms with people that have widely different missions. At CJET last year, we were put in a room with for-profit and nonprofit people, and I thought, oh man, I'm going to have to sit here and listen to them talk about equity investment and things like that from the for-profit side. And I found it, it was fascinating to have some of them in the for-profit world look at us and say, you have that much money to do what? And you're squandering it. And it really did, it was a slap in the face for me, and a good one. So even though that we should get together with like-minded people, I think we shouldn't discount the fact that the people running for-profit or microsites shouldn't be attractive to people running statewide organizations. And Dylan's group Lion is a daily reminder of that on Facebook with the posts that I see from various organizations. Yep. So we shouldn't discount different people.
So we have 3 very sage observers of the newspaper industry who have been sitting quietly for the last hour, and I think we should now make them talk, and then we'll take our break. Rem, Jane, Rick, in that order.
Well, first of all, I'm really glad to be here.
with all you people doing this stuff, because I've found the whole rise of nonprofits to be one of the most interesting stories in the field in recent years. And the other thing that really struck me, I wrote a couple of columns about hyperlocal and some of the sites represented in the room, is that for them to keep going, and there are great examples in here like Dylan, it takes the business model, if you to stretch the phrase, I guess, really depends on one person or two people working around the clock 7 days a week. And I guess my hope would be that as this all evolves, that we see ways to keep that kind of passion and mission, but do it in a way that's kind of more sustainable, both for the organization and for the people. That that maybe that's you could actually live a little bit of a life, because to me that's really, I mean, I love the work that the ProPublicas of the world are doing, but I mean, to me it's the best tradition of journalism, the Andy Halls of the world. People just care so much about it and are willing to dedicate their lives to it. But I'd love to see that kind of evolution with support from foundations, shared services, a lot of what we're talking about, to take it to the next step.
So Andy Hall is now a type. Jane.
It kind of feels to me like what I'm hearing in this room is a distillation of everything that we see in here at the Online News Association, and especially over the past 5 years. Things are moving so quickly, and I actually have sympathy for everyone who's trying to keep up with it and trying to help. I'll tell you that the evolution as we've seen it, which will be no surprise to anyone, is all of our programming at our conference, which is probably where we have the biggest bulk attendance and the biggest eyes and ears, has just evolved, not just evolved, but just stampeded into business needs and demands and technology needs and demands. The journalism is, of course, important, and it's the end game, but the big thing right now is how do I sustain? And once I figure that out, how do I keep moving at the speed that we need to move to get news out and move it out accurately? So it seems to me, I've been hearing a lot of great suggestions around the table, and I know we're going to be talking about some of those later on. But it does seem to me that the only way that we're going to address all this is that we need to move as quickly as we possibly can. I think part of our role as journalists, it has always been to sit back and analyze, and what I've really felt like in the last 5 years especially is that the faster we can move to help folks, the better off we're all going to be.
But this conversation sounds very similar to what you hear from the for-profits.
Yes.
Yeah. Fascinating. Rick.
Absolutely.
Rich, you get the final word before we go off to
I love
caffeine.
it.
So
Thank you so much.
make the most of it.
I'll try to be quick. I have three thoughts. I like, having been to a lot of these kinds of meetings, the sort of rising level of confidence and knowledge of good practice that's in this room. I think that's a big change from 3 or 4 years ago, where people in this business felt like kind of lonesome pioneers. I would say from the newspaper business, angle of newspaper business, which I have as my particular focus, it's been alluded to, but I think a new factor is how eager newspapers are for collaboration and for good material. And that's at least I think that's a win-win, and it's certainly a way to get some distribution for
How many of the organizations represented around the table syndicate? Well, I was going to ask that question next. Now, how many of you make money from syndication?
Yeah, you can do it either way. I mean, you can do it and make some money, or you can do it basically to extend the reach of the good work you do.
And audience is what we're going to come back to after. We're going to leave business behind, having solved all of those issues.
One more.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
If I could, Alan. I was interested in reading the Knight report this particular report was not going to address quantity and quality, or try to measure that, and that's understandable. But I still think that's a huge lingering issue here, is exactly how much important resource has gone away from newspapers, magazines, to some extent television. Are there ways to go from 170 organizations to, somebody said 1,500, that might be a next step.
It is. I mean, if you look at the gap, Amy, what's the gap? What's the drop off over the last 3 decades? No, I'm talking about the drop off in newsroom employment. And so the most optimistic, this gets to your point, I think partly, Eric, the most optimistic assessment of what this nonprofit sector can do is a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of that lost resources. I think that's part of the point you're making. 10-minute break, then we'll come back and we'll get to great journalism and audience engagement.